then you look at the other side of it, and there's the societal pressure that is going in the wrong direction. And I know this is going to sound like me beating a dead horse, but social media has fucked it up for a lot of guys, because guys are looking at what it is that babes are saying they want. Guys are looking at what it is that is supposedly expected of them. And this whole thing of
the royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who likes his woman the same exact way he likes his yogurt. He is also a man who may include skipping leg day to his cardio routine. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B, and I am here to talk about women and their choices. But yeah, it's mainly about the women and the fact that their choices and preferences might be rubbing some people off a different way. Like, it's actually quite interesting. The fact that some shifts that might not have seemed so big had a particularly big change, but also at the same time something that people would hold on to and be like, no, this will never change, suddenly, like, there are examples that are showing that that's not exactly the case. What am I talking about? I will get to that in a bit, but before I can do any of that, first off, I want to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you listen all the way till the end. And should you like what it is that you're listening to? Should you not like it? Should you have a different form of feedback? Or should you want to suggest a potential topic and or guest that I can have on the podcast? Then the DMs are always open. The social media links are always in the description. They rarely ever change. So you can send that DM and I will handle it accordingly. Now, with that said, I do need to get this show on the road because I have quite a bit to talk about. And I want to kick things off by talking about HR. Now, if there's people that understand a little bit more about the hiring scenario and the job market in corporate, it is people from HR. They do tend to interview people and they do tend to talk amongst each other. So they'd probably know a little bit more as far as hiring is concerned, as opposed to the largest lot of us that are usually just busy saying, either we want a job, we don't want a job, or we are just having the job and we're trying to move up. So when a lady in HR hopped online to talk about how apparently there are fewer men that are applying for corporate jobs or even putting effort, it did pique my interest quite a bit, because I do feel like this is a discussion that is worth having. Now, I am going to let the clip play, then I can get into my thoughts on the entire thing. So, without further ado,
are women becoming more aggressive in corporate, or are men slowly checking out of the system? Because where many of us HR, Josie, we were with another HR, and we noticed something interesting. We realized that whenever we post even a job advert, almost 90% of the applicants are from women. And before someone says I'm saying this because I am a woman, relax. This is literally what we're saying in recruitment. And women are applying in large numbers, whatever the position. And they're coming up prepared, and you call someone for an interview, she has researched for the company, she knows what the company does, she understands her role, she even questions the panel, and sometimes she'll even tell you things about your company that you don't even expect her to know. Then occasionally a man walks in and it looks like he has been ambushed. A very simple question like, what do you know about our company? And he says, honestly, I just saw the advert. My brother, you had 3 days to Google us. And this is where the conversation is becoming controversial, because it feels like women are becoming extremely aggressive in corporate spaces. They are applying more, they are preparing more, they're pushing harder for opportunities, even inside wakishaingia kwa kazi. Meanwhile, men seem to be shifting their energy elsewhere. Biashara, online, trading, side hustles, cars, electronics, which is not a bad thing. But hiyo kitu nimekuwa nikifikiria. I don't know if it's the system that is shifting, or it's women who are becoming more dominant in corporate, or simply men have decided that corporate ladder is no longer worth the climb. Because when you sit on the HR side of the table long enough, you start noticing patterns that most people outside recruitment do not see, and this is definitely one of them. Let me know if you as a HR you've noticed this, or men, what happened to you in owning corporate iluabo, or women, is it that, anyway, Let me know what you think.
Okay. So this lady has come up and said that apparently, it's women that seem to be putting in a lot more of these applications. Men don't seem as eager. And she wants to know the reasons why. Okay, normally, if I'm handling something like this, I would probably be like, you know what, maybe there could be the bias of probably it's the industry she's in and the sector. And, maybe she's just, not interacting with enough HR people to see the kind of efforts that guys put in. Because, you find like tech related positions, STEM related positions will probably have more men, just generally speaking. But the thing is, this isn't the first time I've heard this. Actually, I've heard someone who also deals with a lot of HR people making the same remark. And also, more so than that, I've also had this kind of discussion on the podcast sometime towards the end of last year. And the thing is, like, it is actually something that might actually become a problem after a bit of a while. Now, of course, she did ask the reasons why guys could be doing this. And okay, I can't speak for all guys, but if I was to take a guess from my kind of angle, I'd say that it comes down to about two reasons. The first one being little, if not lack of motivation, and the second one being a negative societal pressure, or just societal pressure in the negative direction or in the wrong direction. And I'm gonna explain why those two things actually do carry quite a bit of weight. So when you look at the whole lack of motivation, you find that for quite a number of years, you could even say for quite a number of decades, women have been getting encouraged by parents, by their peers, by colleagues when they're in the workplace, by teachers when they're in school, to basically go out and put in the work and make sure they are very successful and they get into the corporate world and they rise to the bloody top. And it is something that has brought in, particularly positive effects. And I remember when I was talking about the discussion I had with my friend towards the end of last year, it did actually kind of go towards that light where she would go for certain classes and it would be like one man and the rest of the class is women. And the argument would be, maybe it's because she's gone for a HR-based certificate or some shit. But nah, this was in completely different disciplines and she'd go for those classes and it would be majority women. Also, I have noticed quite a bit that there are a lot of women that seem to be climbing up the corporate ladder. And, it's, that positive reinforcement is a very good thing. But now, when you look at the guys, when you look at a lot of men, a lot of these guys, I'm not going to say have been neglected, but you've heard the statements that people say about raising boys. They'll say that it's easier to raise boys. And as someone once said online, it's not easier to raise boys, it's just easier to neglect them. So you find that a lot of these guys are kind of just left to their devices, and provided they don't fuck shit up, provided they don't do anything particularly wrong, they're not steered in a positive direction. So they get to uni and they have zero direction, and they finish from uni and they think about getting a corporate job and it just doesn't seem appealing, especially when they are being influenced by people that are telling them to start side gigs, to start working online, to get into Forex. And those very same people that are telling these young guys to do that are flashing around money and making it seem as though they are ultra successful because they got into those things. And a lot of times these young guys will get into that and they'll be like, you know what, screw having a job, screw working in corporate with a shitty boss that treats you like shit and you make peanuts, let me go do that. And a lot of times these guys realize that that wasn't the smartest path. Some of these guys might have even chosen to stop school, and stuff like that does impact a lot of young guys coming up. So a lot of the guys that could have gone to corporate and decided to go down that path basically leave this gap that is being filled by women. Then you look at the other side of it, and there's the societal pressure that is going in the wrong direction. And I know this is going to sound like me beating a dead horse, but social media has fucked it up for a lot of guys, because guys are looking at what it is that babes are saying they want. Guys are looking at what it is that is supposedly expected of them. And this whole thing of, you should figure shit out, or, it's up to you as a guy to make your own money by whichever means. And then, like, the people that are basically taking the babes that they want are the guys that seem to have a lot of this money, leave them in this position where the girl they want and the money they want are all in one direction, and on the other side is a guy that looks like he didn't put in that much effort to get there. So of course these guys are gonna try some other shit, because corporate is a long way. Like corporate, if you go and you put in the work, yes, you'll earn peanuts and maybe you can make a lot more money down the road, but it's not painted up as this very good idea or this amazing opportunity to go and improve your life. It's actually touted as boring. So for a lot of these guys, considering that now they're not feeling as motivated to get into corporate and they're motivated, towards being a sharp boy or a forex trader or some shit, and the forex traders and the online guys that they look up to seem to be flashing pretty good money, the idea of them getting into corporate just doesn't seem as appealing. And I know it sucks. It probably isn't the best thing to say, but it's the reality of what's happening for a lot of guys, and up until we can change that shit, we're gonna have a lot of guys that are not making that much money and are barely getting into corporate, and it'll continue becoming an issue for women in the dating market up until people actually start to look at the issue keenly and start trying to figure out a way to motivate guys positively. Because I kid you the hell not, there's even studies to this. If you motivate people positively, regardless of whether they're male or female, they actually tend to perform a hell of a lot better than when you motivate them negatively or you don't motivate them at all. So maybe we should start motivating guys a little bit more. Maybe we should start showing just how fake these online guys are so that more of these guys can get into corporate. But to be honest, up until we can do something about that and motivating young men, you will see a lot of young men putting in the work on something that isn't sustainable, and there'll be no one else to blame but ourselves. Because at some point in time, we're going to have to admit that we actually did not do much to assist a lot of young men for a certain period of time. But, maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe I'm whining for guys who probably should have been putting in work. I don't know. Either way, I'm gonna leave it at that and move it on to our main topic of this episode. And this one I find to be interesting because it's more on preferences, but unlike what some people might think would really be what it is that we should be discussing as far as preferences are concerned, I think people look at it a little bit wrongly. People look at it as men will always prefer this or women will always prefer that, yet that's not always the case. A lot of times preference is a very subjective thing and will vary from person to person, and usually stuff like this is self-explanatory. Except that in this day and age of the internet, where people believe that their opinions are law, people tend to come up and they're like, that's not the reality, and they try to bring in something different, and it doesn't turn out so well for the other person. So in this particular case, I came across a Reddit post where a woman was busy talking about how men, more so Kenyan men, do get triggered by some women's preferences or just women having preferences. And when I read the post, I found it to be interesting, not because of what it was that she was saying, but the fact that even she kind of fell victim to the same exact thing that she was talking about. But anyways, let me not beat around the bush too much. Let me just read the post. So it says, and I quote, "I've been really active on Reddit for the past 6 or so months, and I'm a woman in my early 20s, by the way. Ever since I joined, I keep seeing posts where a woman simply states what she wants and suddenly it turns into a full breakdown of her quote-unquote value. Mind you, I consider myself privileged, and the guys in my social circle are just as privileged, if not much more privileged. I've never had any of these types of conversations play out with them. They don't even understand what 50-50 is when you ask them. Like, I recently went out on a date and the guy freaked out when he remembered he forgot to pay my parking ticket and sent me 1K, which was 10 times more for the ticket. For example, I recently saw a post where a woman clearly stated what she's looking for: religion, lifestyle, financial stability, etc. on a dating app. And the guy took a screenshot to come mock her on Reddit, talking about her age, calling her unrealistic, and bringing up the fact that she's a single mom. But here's what's confusing me. If she's truly undesirable and unrealistic as people claim, why does it bother you this much? Why shouldn't she just naturally be ignored? Why does it turn into think pieces, group discussions, and character analysis over someone you supposedly wouldn't date anyways? It almost feels like some men are less offended by the standards themselves and more by the fact that you don't meet them. Because if you genuinely didn't qualify and didn't care, you just scroll, no? And the guys here say, a wealthy, high-value man would never choose that. when in reality, I've never sat down with a wealthy guy and heard them having conversations about a woman's value tied to her age, looks, or being a single mom. They do care about promiscuity, but they don't care about age or being a single mom. When my mom divorced my dad, she had all kinds of executives and famous business moguls asking for her hand in marriage, knowing she was a 30-year-old single mom. She later married a diplomat who's my stepdad, and even now at 50, if she wanted to divorce him, there are still other quote-unquote high-value men after her. She's also extremely beautiful, but I thought the guys here say beauty isn't enough for a high-value rich man. So why are all these projections coming from? And why are they there? End quote. Okay, quite a bit has been written here, and quite a bit needs to be answered. But I'm not gonna lie, the wild part about it is she's busy talking about, oh, I find it weird how some of these guys always questioning the preferences, but I chill with privileged people, and they've never heard of 50-50. It's actually a little funny. Like, why would those guys' preferences for 50-50? And I'm not saying this because I'm a guy that, speaks for it to some degree, but why does it bother you so much if you suddenly have to bring that up and talk about how, you chill with privileged people who don't really give a shit? Like, isn't that also judging guys in an indirect way? I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe it is. But in my opinion, I feel like this is one of those instances where she just doesn't understand why people discuss preferences the way they do. And yes, I get it. For the most part, it's usually very senseless. It's not a constructive discussion for a lot of people. And for the most part, it is usually just banter amongst people that are basically just trying to judge, and you could argue to some degree project what it is that they like or don't like about something. And a lot of this doesn't even just apply to just preferences in dating. And it doesn't just apply to women. I think it's just that there's a lot more guys that have become a lot more vocal about this. Yet, when you look at it, people have had these discussions all the time. This is basically like if a guy decided to go to the club and they're wearing a pink shirt saying, I love Barbies, and they're rocking some matte deep red lipstick and they're going to hit on babes busy saying, I want to take you home. Of course people are gonna talk about dude. And yes, maybe the lipstick is a bit of an extra touch on that one, making it a bit more extreme. But the point is, when you're in the dating market, and you kind of have to think of it as a market, whenever there are situations that seem like they are outstanding or outlying, people can discuss them from time to time. Not because they are particularly bad, but because people just don't see that as the regular for a lot of people. So, for example, she mentioned this supposed lady who spoke about wanting a religious, financially stable man, and she's a single mom and shit. It's not something that you would really expect all that much of, because they'd expect that, most single moms would be okay with taking a little less, because, their value in the market, as per some people, isn't all that much. So as a result of that, they'd expect her to be aiming a little lower, but she's still aiming pretty high. And for them, that just doesn't seem like a good thing. And as such, they'll decide to have that discussion. But at the end of the day, preferences are wild for some people, okay for others. But at the end of the day, they're always going to be subjective. So I don't really see how that is that big of a problem, but I guess maybe the over discussion of some of them might rub some people off the wrong way. Although, speaking of preferences, if there is one thing that I've noticed, it's the fact that a lot of people like talking about how high net worth individuals supposedly select people. And honestly, I don't know if people notice this, or at least a lot of the people that talk about such have noticed, but a lot of times it's very, very wrong. You can talk about upper middle class people and how they'll select, and that one can be a little easier to spot. But if you look at high net worth, very, very wealthy individuals, you realize how they select people is very different. And more often than not, the people that talk about such have zero fucking idea about what it is that these guys look for. And I think that's why whenever I look at some of these discussions about, a high net worth man or a high value man should be going for this and this, or wouldn't want this and this, and I'm like, do y'all actually pay attention to some of these guys? Because all of these just sound like things that you would want if you made a shit ton of money. So in reality, it's not like what it is that you think high net worth or very wealthy men want is actually the reality of what very wealthy men want, or just very wealthy people in general. And the reason I can say this is because if you kind of observe, you realize that for the most part, these guys don't really care about a bunch of the stuff that people look for. And you might question it and be like, oh, but you know, she fits this, she fits that. But the reality of it is, first of all, very wealthy people live in a completely different world. And I don't think most people actually understand just how different of a world that is up until you either get a glimpse of it or you spend some time with very wealthy people. And I'm not going to talk about the world much, but one thing that you do notice over time is the fact that not only do they just interact with people from that world, but they also date from within that world, and they try not to deviate as much because deviation can be a problem for them. And there's reasons for this, because if you are a part of that world, then it's not going to be a problem for you to get used to and acclimatized to that world. So it's part of the reason why you can find someone like Kim Kardashian, who has basically done all manner of things. She's been naked on the internet. She's been someone's masturbation content since like 2009. But she's managed to date celebrities. She's managed to get married to and have kids with a rapper. And even after all of that shit, she is currently dating one of the greatest drivers in Formula One. It's not because this guy doesn't have options. It's because he's going to be looking at the options within the scope of the world that he lives in. So it's not like most of the people that are kind of looking up to possibly being with such a guy are really ever going to be with such a guy, not unless if they're a part of that world. So they're willing to compromise on things like having another kid. They're willing to compromise on things like not such a great reputation if they can end up with a babe that they know is from that world and is seeming to be a particularly good option. So it's not that they can't date outside, it's just that they would much rather date from within their circle than go and try and make that risk outside of said circle. So for the most part, like most of this, oh, you know, high value man shit, like this mostly applies to people that are in the middle class and, you know, a little bit up. But for the most part, that shit doesn't apply to very wealthy individuals, at least from what I've seen. But anyways, all that said and done, she also brought up the fact that she is from privilege and she spends a lot of time with privileged guys. And she's never heard them even bring up this whole thing of 50-50 or even, you know, just have some of these discussions that guys have on preference. Now, depending on what level of privilege she may supposedly have come from, a lot of the guys that are from quite a bit of privilege usually don't openly have these discussions with everyone. Like that's stuff that they can go and sit and laugh about when they're at the bar amongst themselves as guys. Like, it's not like it's something that guys will have all the time in the world to come and rant about on the internet. A lot of these guys have other shit to do. So if they do have these preferences, they're just not talking about them. Also, one thing that you notice with a lot more people who have money, the more they go up, the more quiet they'll become on some of the preferences and opinions that they have, because they just don't want to talk about shit like that, and it's usually easier for them to just keep quiet and ignore or just act like it doesn't particularly bother them. So there's a pretty good chance that they just haven't brought it up because, you know, you're a girl and they wouldn't want to bring that up with you, or they just know if they encounter someone like that, they just ignore. Like, that's quite literally it. And the more privileged they are, the more they're allowed to go and test out those preferences and decide to drop some or pick others, considering that they have the money and the means to do that. But oftentimes, like I said earlier, they'll usually go for people that are within the same circle. So even when she was talking about how she had a very beautiful mom who was 30 and a single mom, but there were still guys going for her, it's because the mom was a part of that world. She was introduced to it and she got exposed. So provided that she didn't look like a bad option for a lot of these guys, considering that world and that pool tends to be quite small, of course a bunch of those guys would want to be with her. Like I said earlier, they would much rather deal with someone from their circle that doesn't have the best public reputation but is known for being a particularly dope or nice person within their circles than basically go out of their circle and look for someone potentially good and hope that they'll acclimatize quite well if they're brought into the circle and they spend a bunch of time in there. Like, that's usually a risk that they don't want to take too many times. So for the most part, like, a lot of this stuff, I think, is a case of someone that has probably been in privilege and has seen life differently from a different kind of world and is thinking that same exact principle applies to a lot of the other people that aren't at that level or in that world, which really isn't the case. The preferences on this other side just don't really work that way. People will estimate value on something completely different as opposed to the world of ultra high net worth individuals. So as such, it's basically like comparing apples to oranges, even though they are basically both called fruits. So for the most part, I looked at it for a bit and I was like, to be honest, I think she's just not really understanding that the preferences that she's talking about don't necessarily apply to the people that she's talking to. And maybe she might not get this, maybe she might, but you find that over time, like, it's not really a question of who's done what, where, when, and how. It's usually just down to value. The more value a person has, the more they get to choose and the more they'll be chosen. So you can say that, for example, beauty isn't the most valuable thing, but for people who put beauty on a particularly high pedestal, they may be willing to compromise on a couple of other elements because they want beauty. On the other hand, you can say the same for money. On the other hand, you can say the same for other things. So when it comes down to it, it's more a case of value and how that value affects your preferences, as opposed to what that value means to a bulk of society or not. Because at the end of the day, like I mentioned in Dating Rap 2025, there's a lot more guys that seem to be getting into relationships with these single moms. You know, people have been talking shit about them, but you know, they're still bagging dudes out here. So there's clearly guys that don't mind that, provided that the woman ticks another set of boxes. So to kind of conclude all of this, what I am trying to say is, it's okay to have your preferences. Like, your personal preferences are subjective and they're entirely up to you, but whatever preferences you have, are they optimized for you to get more people, or are they optimized for you to get the person that you believe would be the best for you? And is there a mix somewhere that can probably guarantee that you get better options for yourself? Because at the end of the day, like I said, your preferences are subjective. Although, then again, maybe I could be wrong about this and I don't entirely understand it, but either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on IG. It is at the breaktime_podcast. On Facebook, it is at the breaktime podcast. On X, it is at Bagaka the D. And on Bluesky, it is at the breaktimepod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.